He blogs and is currently working on a book, The Age of the Warlord Entrepreneur. And he's going to talk to us about basically the future of futures research, and how things are changing. Please help me welcome Noah Raford.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm positioned in between this beautiful theory and this beautiful application, which you'll get next. I'm going to try and act as a bridge between these two approaches to the future and to resilience. I'd like to start with this question: who's sick of the future? We all hear this again and again. Everything's accelerating. Volatility is increasing. It's all uncertain. And while this may be true, it's also quite scary. And it's good for guys like me who help communities and governments and corporations deal with change and uncertainty and volatility. But there's also a lot of truth to it. There's evidence that we're actually pretty bad at predicting the future. We like to select things which we believe in. We ignore things which we don't. We underestimate the true complexity of the world and how things are evolving. And we don't like to have uncomfortable conversations. And this really leaves us exposed to all sorts of risks and uncertainties, and also blinds us to all sorts of opportunities in creative things which we could take advantage of. So what do we do? Do we give up? Do we try to predict the future harder? I'd like to address that with an example. Now imagine one of your friends is getting married in a beautiful tropical island. You want to go, but you have a big project due at work the week beforehand. What do? There's generally two approaches to this, which represent two different schools of thought for thinking about decision-making under uncertainty. The first opportunity is you book in advance, right? And you risk losing the ticket if you don't finish your project. The other approach is you wait until you know if you finish your project, and then you risk paying a lot of money by buying a ticket at the last moment. Now, these represent two schools of thought, which I'll call anticipation, or planning, and agility, or adaptation. The first, anticipation, is all about trying to forecast how things might unfold and putting yourself in a position to take advantage of the way things might unfold in a good way and avoid the bad things. So every year, these bears know that the salmon are going to come upstream, and if they sit on the top of this waterfall, they'll be able to get a nice lunch. It's like the seagull example. There's a hockey player in Canada you may have heard of, someone named Wayne Gretzky, considered one of the famous best hockey players in the world. And when asked what the secret to his success was, he said, "I try to skate to where the puck will be." This represents this anticipation approach very, very well. On the other hand, there's the agility approach to dealing with change and uncertainty, or adaptation. The philosophy here is that it doesn't matter what's coming your way. You want to be light and fast and like a ninja, and you can deal with anything. Joi Ito, the new head of the MIT Media Lab, or not so new now, I guess, has this great phrase which summarizes this. He says, "I'm calling myself a nowist. I'm trying to figure out how to build up the ability to react to anything." Right, this captures this agility approach. Now, these two schools of thought for dealing with change are often pitted against each other, anticipation versus agility, and you have this positional response between advocates of, you've got to predict better, and big data will help us predict better, and then the agilists are like, no, you can't, it's impossible, it's too complex, we might as well just try and adapt as quickly as we can and have as few assets as possible and be quick. But actually, what I want to say is that how you respond and the strategy that you take very much depends on the kinds of decisions that you're making and the kind of environment that you're in. So if you're making big investments that cost a lot to change, and you're not going to know if that's a good investment or not for quite a long time, you're more in the realm of anticipation. Right? This is like buying a flat. You're only going to do it a few times, it costs a lot to buy, costs a lot to change, and you're not going to know what the return on investment is for a long time. On the other hand, if you're doing something like sport, right, you're making a lot of small decisions, it's easy to change in the middle of the stream, it doesn't cost that much, and you know pretty quickly if it's working or not. This is in the realm of agility. So the question here, and I think one of the most interesting secrets for success, if you will, in the 21st century is, what happens up here? What goes on in this situation where you can, making big investments, it costs a lot to change, right, but you might be getting fast feedback on that as well, and you have to make a lot of them. So what I'd like to propose is actually possible to integrate anticipation and agility, and the way to do that is through this thing called strategic foresight. Now, strategic foresight is kind of what futurists call themselves when they're embarrassed to call themselves futurists. But this is basically a process where you're looking at what is changing in the world now. What is changing? What you don't know about how things might unfold, and you try to say, how might this evolve into the future? So it's a speculative exercise, it's an imaginative exercise, which you bolster with analysis, but it's about looking around at the present. And you try and imagine and rehearse your response in each of these future worlds. So you're saying, I'm not just going to bet on this thing turning out in this one particular way. I'm going to explore how things might unfold in a variety of scenarios, these are often called scenarios, and respond and plan to deal with many of them. So what I want to advocate is that this is actually, although you're talking about the future, these are conversations that are really about today. So strategic foresight, futurism, this is really actually about orienting ourselves to now. And this is the secret of integrating these two. Let me give you an example. So a couple of years ago, UPS, global shipping and logistics company, started to get really worried about avian influenza, bird flu, right? A lot of avian influenza scenarios look really bad for corporations that depend on global transport. Travel quarantines, shutting down borders, et cetera. So they started thinking, how can we deal with a variety of different pandemic flu scenarios? Turns out, thankfully, there wasn't a very severe pandemic flu, but a couple of years later, we had the volcano. And by thinking about how they would respond to air travel getting shut down, and by thinking about what their response might be under a variety of different severity conditions, they actually had some plans in place, and they were able to respond much quicker in the moment. And they flew all their goods to Istanbul, they put them on lorries, they trucked them all through Europe, and things were a little bit more expensive, they took a little bit more time, but at the end of the day, they were able to stay active and survive, and actually look like champions relative to their competitors who were scrambling to deal with this situation, which they had never even imagined. So it's a good example of integrating anticipation and agility. Even though they didn't predict the future, they were wrong about the particular cause, they were right about the impacts. And by thinking about the impacts, they were able to adapt quicker. How does this really work? So we all have these mental models in our head. You've probably heard of this before. And these range from everything from how to cook fondue, how to host a meeting, how to host a friend at your house, to more profound things such as how your market is evolving, what the right thing to do in a policy setting is. And these exist as individuals and communities, these vary across environments. Now, even if our mental models are perfectly in sync with the outside world, and I actually think this is not possible, there is no right mental model, gradually over time they get out of sync with the way things are changing. Right? We begin to focus on the operational details of our day-to-day life, on meeting this deadline, on managing this relationship, and before you know it, you're totally out of sync with the way the world has occurred, and you don't even know it. Right? And this is what Taleb and Kahneman and Tetzlaff are talking about, that we begin to become overconfident. And our overconfidence is what gets us in trouble here. Right? It exposes us to these blind spots and really gets us in places we don't want to be. So, foresight is a whole process about looking for change. It's trying to identify in our environment the things which we don't know, the things which we aren't aware of, and trying to orient ourselves as communities, as individuals, as companies, nations, to what's actually changing now. Now, this is from the movie Predator, 1986 or something like that. It's a great metaphor for this. It's sort of a cheesy movie, but did Arnold Schwarzenegger ever imagine he'd be in a jungle having to fight an invisible alien? No, not at all. In order to actually survive, he had to learn to see the unseen. And that's what this process of foresight is about. You're learning to see the unseen. You're starting to look in a peripheral vision at all the things that are changing that are not what you're focused on, and give that some degree of honesty. Trying to say, right, that's changing over there. It might not be core to my business. It might not be what I'm most interested in, but I actually can see how that might evolve into something which would totally disrupt my day-to-day life. So foresight is about looking for a change in the environment now, and in doing so, and thinking about how this plays through in the future, you're actually re-perceiving the present. This is this great phrase from Kees van der Heijden, one of the original scenario planning guys, and I like it because it's a kind of a contradictory idea that you talk about the future in order to perceive the present in a different way. But that's what we're talking about here. We're actually talking about trying to imagine how things might change, and in doing so, change our response in the moment. This is particularly true, and this becomes particularly powerful when you then start to make that experiential. Right? The military, the emergency responders, the police, they're really good at this. This is like the weaponized version of gamification. Right? They have these things called tactical decision games, where they literally sit around and say, what would happen if terrorists were to attack our nuclear plant and we'd had to respond, and it turns out they were using drones, and then we had to evolve this and that. These situations that are really ultimately scenarios, and they game it out. Right? Sometimes they game it out physically, sometimes they game it out around a table, but they then try to imagine their response. And imagining their response, in role-playing this out, they are able to be more mentally and socially resilient. This is particularly important because, as we all know from our real lives, there are certain topics which are just not very comfortable to talk about, right? If you're, let's say, you're Kodak and you're invested in film, you don't want to talk about digital media, right? And that's what kills you in the end. So scenarios offer this phrase, which one of my mentors told me, this idea of they're containers for disagreement. It produces a space, because you're talking about the future, of course it hasn't happened, might not actually happen, it's uncertain, in which you can consider things which are politically dangerous to talk about in the present. And this process of thinking this through is what's so effective about the foresight process. Some of my friends, Stuart Candy and Jake Dunnigan, have this great phrase: it's better to be surprised by simulation than blindsided by reality. I think this captures this whole approach to foresight and dynamic change. But foresight isn't just about corporate surprise and pandemic flu and these large sort of national military disasters. It's actually about creativity and inspiration as well. Blake has this great quote that imagination is our highest faculty and central to our perception and experience of reality. So if we're going out in the world and starting to say, how might the world change? You're actually having to imagine that, because there's no facts that are coming to you from the future. You're imagining how things might evolve. And that process of imagination enables some new insights, which can be quite useful for product development, policy development, strategy development, etc. To show a quick example of how this works, normally in a scenario process, you go from the outside in. You look at the contextual environment of your industry, your country, your regional competitors, etc. And you say, how's that going to affect your transactional environment? Your suppliers, your customers, the things which you have some degree of control over. And then how might they react in such a way that you have more influence over what you do have influence over? Your staff, your strategic decision making, your investment choices, etc. So if you combine this outside-in approach to a traditional design approach where you're going from the inside out, then you start to get this thing which I like to call human-centered foresight. It's coming from the center of an issue and identifying who are the users, what are their interests, and how might those then collide with these changing external factors. And that actually turns out to be really, really fun and creative. So here's a kind of a cute example. There's a great blog post out there by an ex-journalist named Mark Potts. You can Google it. It's called A View of the Future of News from 20 Years Ago. And in it, he describes this world where the managing editor of the Washington Post at the time, a guy named Bob Kaiser, went to a foresight conference in Japan that Apple was involved in and learned about this extraordinary new world of the internet and how things were changing, and how in the future you might be able to actually interact with your devices through touch, and you might be able to use high-speed networks to contribute content, receive content, and imagine the world of bloggers and social media and all these things in 1992. Now, it kind of seems trivial to us now because it's so powerfully integrated into our day-to-day lives. But in 1992, this was actually quite a kind of science fiction idea at the end of the day. So he got so inspired, he came back and he worked with Mark Potts, the author of that blog post and one of the designers at the time, to create this prototype. And this is called Postcard, right? It was done in HyperCard, great little programming language, 1992. And it envisioned basically the template for what Washington Post Online became. And Washington Post was one of the main movers as a major newspaper into the online space originally. Now, okay, very cool, right? Not that surprising for us now. And in fact, the idea of interactive screens and these types of media has been around forever. Buckminster Fuller spoke about it, even before that, Jules Verne. So it's not that the ideas themselves were new, but it was the reality of someone in a decision-making role realizing, wow, that's actually possible now. That's happening soon, and we got to deal with that, or else we're going to get eaten for lunch. Let me give you one more example. I'm surprised that no one's mentioned drones yet as a conference about the future. I must get some prize for mentioning drones first. But we all are familiar with drones changing, evolving. This is a technology and a social application and legal implications that has both military and personal civilian application. So a friend did a design workshop around, well, what are some civilian applications for drones? And this is a foresight exercise, a creative foresight exercise, and came up with these two prototypes. Imagine you have 360-degree high-resolution cameras, which you can stream to your glasses, right? Then you can develop a service out-of-body experience. You fly a little drone around, you can look through your glasses, you can see the space, you can look around. I saw a video the other day that was 360-degree panable, zoomable video of a volcano. It was on Der Spiegel. You probably can Google it. Another idea, which actually is becoming prototyped now by this company, Matternet, high-speed transport by drone of medicines, hearts, transplants, etc. And that led to this prototype out of San Francisco. Did anyone see Taco Copter? Turned out not to be real. It was a spoof. But it's an interesting idea of prototyping a way business like this might actually work. It was drone delivery of burritos in San Francisco. Seems a little funny and trivial and whimsical until you actually come across a company like this, which is actually a Geneva-based company run by some friends, and they're actually developing the drone delivery API for every city in the world, or for any city in the world, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it. Three-dimensional environments, highly congested. Drone delivery makes a lot of sense. It's like a sort of robo-concierge. Flies to your door, drops it off while you're at work, it's no problem. So you see how this looking at the view, an alternative view on the future, can translate into interesting design, product, and services. So how is this different from focus groups, gaming workshops, a lot of the kind of traditional strategy activities which we tend to do? Well, here's my argument. This is a little contentious, that actually most of these things where you're focusing more on what the present day wants are for your consumers and your customers and your stakeholders, it actually optimizes our understanding of the present in a very dangerous way. Right? It's like reinforcing our own mental model in a way which basically disconnects us from the change. Because foresight and scenarios, they focus on the things which are uncertain, and they begin to explore that in an imaginative exercise. It's not like you're fact-finding. You probably read this quote or heard this quote from Henry Ford. If I've asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a better horse. Turns out he didn't actually say this. You should Google it. It's not true at all, but it's a great phrase. And I think that's kind of what foresight is designed to fight against. This idea that you spend more and more time doing things right as opposed to doing the right thing. This is a very foxy approach to resilience, in fact. Okay, so I just want to end on one thought. So if we acknowledge that foresight is important for dealing with the way that the world might actually change, it helps us imagine and talk about and prepare for unexpected surprises. The way that we actually do that is fundamentally changing, and the web, like many things, is changing how that is possible. Large-scale participatory networked approaches to everything are kind of fashionable these days, and there's a reason, because they're powerful. And right now, in terms of foresight, we're kind of here with these online scenario planning approaches. We're meeting the demands of the lower-end consumer, the people who couldn't afford or wouldn't want to invest in the 500,000 euro 6-year scenario planning project. Actually, that's more like a 6-month scenario project for some consultancies, but we're moving fast up the ladder. And I think in probably 18, 24 months, we're going to start to see some pretty much industrial strength foresight applications which can be done over the web with a tremendous number of participants that has all of the kind of implication for learning and inspiration that a traditional foresight workshop does, but it's decentralized over the web. Let me give you 2 examples. My friends at the Institute for the Future just ran this global online game called Connected Citizens, exploring the future of public services. They had about 500 people in over 50 countries, creating 7,000 ideas and forecasts in 24 hours about how government might need to change in an algorithmic, automated, virtual world. One of the cool things that came out of that was the idea that as automation increases in public services, the role of the face-to-face contact will also increase. So as all the backroom paperwork gets dealt with, all the bureaucracy gets dealt with through algorithms and automation, the civil servant's job is actually going to be able to be dealing with the exceptions, to relate on the ambiguous human elements. I kind of like that idea, sort of government and civil service being rehumanized through a big data process. We're running a project right now with some colleagues of mine at KTH in Stockholm on the future of Swedish cities and transport. And we're using this Futurescaper platform, which came out of my PhD work. And this is an exercise of putting trends and ideas into a visual mental model. So it's like a mind map. People log onto the site because they care about the topic, or their boss forces them to. And it asks you, what do you think is important about the future? And you construct your own little mind map about the trends and issues which you think are important. And the system then integrates that with what everyone else is saying. Right? So you're able to see how your view of the future interacts with other people's view of the future. And that creates this aggregate network of cause and effect relationships, which you can then build scenarios from. So any individual can go in there and say, I think this, and that are quite important. And then the system will help guide you in a very pedagogical fashion towards well, what's the implications of that? What's the second order implication, the third order implication? And then you can creatively remix that on the fly. So instead of a consultant developing a set of 3, 4, 5 scenarios months down the road in the back room after 1 or 2 workshops with 20 people, you're able to have hundreds of people engaged, and you as an individual are able to contribute your view and actually then remix that with other people's views in a much more empowering, personalized way. Now, this has some benefits. It's faster, much, much faster. It takes an order of days or weeks, whereas past processes took months. It's much cheaper by several orders of magnitude. You get higher participation rates and much more diverse input, which is quite important when you're dealing with things that don't have a right answer. Issues of public policy, issues of dynamic environments, where just getting people involved is part of the outcome. And I think, and this is the jury is still out on this kind of visualization of complexity actually has the potential to lead to better decision making. I mentioned this phrase of scenarios as a container for disagreement. Well, if we can all agree that I see what your perception is on this and you think you can see what my perception is, well then in fact maybe we have the room to say, I see how those connect. I see how this complex web of ideas and trends relate. And we can all kind of agree on this. All right, I don't agree with that, you don't agree with this, but we can agree to disagree in this space. And potentially this has the ability to create a platform for collective action around ideas which are more complex and dynamic. The main thing here is that these types of online approaches are going to act as force multipliers. It's going to enable small organizations who didn't have access to this kind of foresight thinking and these types of strategy processes to do it quickly, to do it cheaply, about the issues that they really care about, right? And I think that's going to have some profound implications, both in good ways and potentially bad ways. So imagine if we lived in a world in which you could very rapidly and easily crowdsource the decisions around, let's see, I've got 2 job options coming up. One is in software development, one is in, let's say, graphic design. Which of these should I do? Well, one involves moving to Zurich, one involves staying in Geneva, and you start to get the people that you trust, and the people who might live in Zurich, and the people who might live in Geneva, to contribute to your question around this, and they start to have ideas which contribute to this, and you can say, okay, looks like if I were to move to Geneva and do software development, it might turn out A, B, C, or D, and I can deal with those outcomes. If I were to stay in Zurich and do graphic design, it might happen A, B, C, or D, the other ways. So I think it's quite an interesting approach, but it has some scary implications. 1975, science fiction author John Brunner wrote this great book called Shockwave Rider, in which he forecast something called the Oracle, where every decision was basically a crowdsourced exercise. Who should I marry? What should I wear today? These types of things. And it rapidly devolved into a dystopic surveillance state. Now, this is definitely a possible outcome here. I'm very sympathetic to Jaron Lanier's argument of digital Maoism, that the more participatory and online these processes become, the less your role as a creative individual is valued, and the more the hive is valued as a result. So I think we need to guard against those. But I just wanted to end on this note that this world, not necessarily this world, but this world of large-scale participatory ability to think about the future, to engage hundreds or thousands of stakeholders around diverse issues that are complex and ambiguous, it's coming. And we do have some agency over it. And I think that if we get ahead of the curve, we're able to respond in a more agile way and then hopefully be more resilient in the future. So thank you.